So welcome everyone to Disrupt the Status Quo, how SEL can address implicit bias and build equity in classrooms and communities. We're so very glad that you are here today. We have an amazing presentation and some wonderful partners that have joined us today to present and to share this with you. So thank you for being here. Thank you for time out of your schedule. I know it's a very, very busy time getting ready for back to school in whatever format that might be for you. We know that it's sort of all over the map. So attending a webinar is a big deal, and we appreciate you taking the time to join ours. We are recording today's session, so if for whatever reason you cannot stay, we will send a link to the recording. And also you can share that out with your colleagues. I hope that you will once the recording is live. So our agenda for today is just to do a few introductions. Of course, talk a little bit about why social-emotional learning is so important right now, and to then talk about SEL as a foundation for safe, supportive, and equitable schools, and the intersection between SEL, juvenile justice, and implicit bias. We will end with some resources and, of course, give you time for some question and answer. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Jennifer Sanderlin. I'm a Senior Education Partnerships Manager with Committee for Children. We are best known for our Second Step program, and I get to work with schools and districts to adopt Second Step to really look at their holistic social-emotional learning implementation in schools, districts, and community-based organizations with out-of-school time, really wrapping around social-emotional learning, bullying prevention, and child abuse prevention. Prior to this work, I was a teacher, a classroom teacher, and also a nonprofit director for out-of-school time and early learning. So just a few decades of work behind me. This is very, very rewarding to help schools and districts, especially this time of year and this particular year, even more so. So thank you for being here. And it is with my great pleasure that I get to introduce our guests. So I'll just tell you a little bit about them and have them say hello quickly, and then we'll get started. So first is Angela Downs. She is a law professor at UNT Dallas College of Law, where she also serves as Assistant Director of Experiential Education. She is a frequent trainer on cultural responsiveness, implicit bias, and diversity issues to attorneys, judges, government entities, and school districts. Professor Downs has also provided training, policy expertise, and technical assistance to nonprofit agencies in the interpersonal violence issues of child abuse, child protection, domestic violence, human trafficking, and elder abuse. She is recognized subject matter expert on interpersonal violence issues. In 2008, Professor Downs was appointed by the governor to serve on the Texas State Board of Examiners of Psychologists, and was reappointed in 2013. The board is the regulatory licensing agency for psychologists in the state. She is Texas Bar Fellow and board member of the Texas Mediator Credentialing Association. Professor Downs also serves as an associate municipal judge for the city of Glen Heights, Texas. That's quite an impressive background. Would you like to say hello really quickly?
Thank you. I'm just, lawyers, we're just so excited to speak. But many thanks to the entire team at Committee for Children, Jen, Kira, and the whole team there. I'm really excited to be with you here today.
Wonderful. Thank you. And our second presenter and guest today is Donna Black. She is a nationally recognized expert in social-emotional learning and is the president of SEL for Texas, an alliance group in Texas that helps to build awareness of SEL and advocates for state and local SEL policies. Donna has been a state leader of SEL in Texas for over 14 years. She's facilitated local and regional projects on SEL and for 6 years has led a state-level initiative on social-emotional wellness for the Texas Education Agency. Donna is also a faculty member at the Academy for SEL, where she provides instruction on SEL to K-12 educators and administrators. program is jointly sponsored by Rutgers University and the University of St. Elizabeth. Donna has been an instructor for the program for the past 5 years. She has received several awards and honors in her career, including Outstanding Advocate Award for School Mental Health from the National Association of School Psychologists and the Outstanding School Psychologist of the Year and Outstanding Contributions to the Profession Awards from the Texas Association of School Psychologists. Also extremely impressive. We are very, very lucky to have you with us today. Donna, would you like to say hello quickly?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Jen, for that wonderful introduction. It was a mouthful, I know. And if everyone hasn't guessed it already, Angela and myself are both from Texas. So we'll be talking a little bit about some of the issues here in Texas, but not just about those. And again, I echo what Angela said. We are so appreciative of the Committee for Children and the staff there and all the hard work you've done for this webinar and in our partnerships. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, it is definitely a mutual feeling to the both of you. We've done some other events together and really collaborating. It's a true partnership, and we're so thankful for that as well. So we've got a big crowd with us today, and I'm very, very excited to have all of you joining us to hear more about what Angela and Donna have to say. But I'll first just give you a little bit about Committee for Children. We are a nonprofit organization located in Seattle, Washington. Our mission is to foster the safety and well-being of children through social emotional learning and development. Our advocacy work is also very important to us. We are a force in advocacy, doing work both at the state and federal levels to really put forward policies and laws to support social emotional learning, of course, but also prevention of bullying and child abuse prevention, child protection. We have been doing this work since 1979. To help victims of child sexual abuse. We started, and then we went on to create programs like the Second Step program that you see there. And probably most of you know us from our program Second Step, to really help raise up children, to create an environment and a society really of people who would never abuse someone else. So we are extremely proud of this work, but we know that we couldn't do that work and reach 16.5 million children every year in all 50 states over the last 40 years. We definitely couldn't do this work without the educators and teachers, counselors, principals, all of those folks in out of school time and other early learning programs, for all of you for helping our mission to become a reality and to make sure that we are really impacting the world in these positive ways that we hope to. So thank you to those of you who might be using the Second Step program. I'm going to assume that most people are here to hear more about social emotional learning because they are interested, and probably many of you are also very knowledgeable about social emotional learning. So I want to say thank you again for being here and for all the work you're doing outside of in your worlds, wherever that may be. All right, so with that, I'd like to go ahead and just start us off with a video that kind of helps us think about why social emotional learning is important right now. It's a pretty critical moment in our history. As you know, we're all in this together. No matter where you live, it's definitely a time for social emotional learning. All right, so here comes that video.
Challenging, unprecedented, uncertain. These words all describe what we're experiencing right now as students, educators, and families are faced with navigating a new normal. But as we plan for the school year ahead, one thing is clear: the intrinsic value of social emotional learning, or SEL. Here's why. 1. SEL can foster a sense of safety and be used with trauma-sensitive practices. Students can't focus on learning if they don't feel safe and supported. The COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis around systemic racism have created traumatic experiences for many families. These experiences contribute to fear, anger, and anxiety, and increase the risk of toxic stress. As part of a trauma-sensitive approach, SEL can help students manage their emotions in a safe and supportive way and set them up for learning success. 2. SEL helps build positive connections and relationships. This upcoming school year involves a lot of uncertainty, and site closures have made it difficult to maintain the strong relationships that previously developed between students, teachers, and families. This fall, whether you're planning for in-person or remote teaching, using SEL to build trusting connections within your learning community can help lay the necessary foundation for academic learning. 3. SEL helps address the learning inequality caused by school closures. Remote learning is inherently challenging and not always appropriate developmentally. Students who are already struggling socially or academically are often the ones who face more severe challenges with remote learning. SEL can play a key role in helping students build the skills they need for effective learning, from self-regulation to problem-solving, especially in an out-of-school setting. 4. SEL provides support to teachers and staff. It's more important than ever to care for educators' well-being. By helping teachers and staff manage stress, build trust with students and colleagues, and stay engaged at work, SEL can strengthen the whole school community. Now is the time to bring SEL front and center. But don't just take our word for it. In a recent survey by CASEL with responses from 37 states, 84% reported that SEL has increased in importance as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And 78% of states reported that district-based SEL requests have increased since the beginning of the pandemic. We often talk about SEL in terms of improving behavior or its academic benefits. But SEL also builds skills that help bring us together in times of crisis and in everyday life. And in this uniquely challenging moment, SEL is a critical tool in both addressing the immediate needs of students, families, and staff, and helping them succeed in the new school year.
Please do share that video far and wide too if you are trying to kind of spread the word about social emotional learning being a very important thing to be paying attention to and raising to the top right now as we navigate these really uncharted waters filled with many, many challenges. So with that, I would like to go ahead and begin our presentation. I know that Angela and Donna both are going to kind of tag team and toggle back and forth a little. So I'll go ahead and unmute both of you. And then I'm going to pass the controls, the power, giving the power to Donna.
Thank you so much, Jen, for that wonderful segue into our discussion here. And I just want to preface all of this by letting everyone know that we're on a first name basis today. And Angela and I will be, rather than talking to you about each and every slide, we're going to conduct this webinar in a discussion format. So we've done this many times, and we like to just talk about the issues and share our perspectives. So it's really going to be a little different than what you might be accustomed to in a webinar. We'll be going back and forth with some comments, and just think of it as a fireside chat today. Maybe a little hot for a fireside, but anyhow.
Why don't we frame it as a poolside chat, Donna?
A poolside chat. Yeah. I love that.
Since it's 100 degrees down here in Texas today.
That's right. So I'm sure that many of you need to relax a bit anyhow with all the stress that we've been under. And as our title says today, we want to disrupt the status quo. And I know that, Angela, and I'm sure you would agree with this, our status quo has been disrupted quite a bit over the past 6 months, mostly due to COVID-19. But then when you follow that with the horrible and horrific event that occurred with George Floyd, then we've been under a tremendous amount of traumatic stress during this past 6 months. And this can actually be a cumulative type of trauma for everyone. And when we're dealing with cumulative trauma, it's going to be a little bit difficult to manage and function every day. And I often think about how our teachers are feeling as they're entering those classrooms, are preparing to enter those classrooms. It can be very disruptive for them. But
Definitely.
But with every disruption comes an opportunity.
That's true, Donna. And I think one of the challenges that everyone is facing is the unknown. We don't know what students have faced at home. We don't know the challenges, financial, health-wise, that they may have faced, that when they do come back to a classroom at some point, and if they're in a remote setting, how are they going to deal with that? And how are you as classroom teachers going to deal with that? And administration. That's where SEL can really build that bridge.
Absolutely. SEL can help mitigate some of those effects that they've had from the traumatic experiences, and can actually help them learn to cope and manage with some of those experiences. But it isn't as easy as it sounds to implement SEL in the structure of the world that we know today, especially in this virtual world that we're living. So we're going to give you some things to think about as you're beginning that process. But as we said, this is an excellent opportunity to disrupt the status quo and take advantage of this opportunity to make some changes that are much needed. So just to start us off here, some of the driving forces behind the social and emotional learning movement or the initiative has been linked to, schools have been just seeing an enormous rise in mental health issues in schools. And those aren't likely to change in the near future, especially with what we've been experiencing. In fact, children will probably come back to us with a much higher need than they've had in the past. Their anxiety levels will probably be higher, depression will be higher, and we'll need to be attuned to some of those things because they can certainly translate into behaviors in the classroom. When children are dealing with emotional problems, we know that those emotional problems manifest themselves in behaviors. So classroom behavior will probably not look the same when it comes back to the face-to-face classroom, if we ever reach that point. Hopefully we will soon. But that's another reason why SEL has become a prominent force in education. The widening gaps in learning is another driving force behind it. You know, when youngsters start out with a disadvantage, equitable opportunities are not available for them, and that gap just widens as they get older. So we have to look at equitable opportunities in order to be able to close those gaps in learning.
And Donna, if I might just interject, the law school is doing some work with kids in an area of town called South Dallas that is known to be economically challenged. And we're finding that even though students were given Chromebooks to take home for the summer to complete their assignments and to kind of have to get used to having the technology, a lot of the homes didn't have internet. They didn't have access. They didn't really know what to do with the technology once they got it home. So there's even the issue of the digital divide that's really plaguing a lot of our students, where they might have the technology in their hands, but they don't have a parent, they don't have anyone around them that knows how to help them navigate it. And they might not even have internet. So that's another issue I think that's really critical for young folks.
You're absolutely right. And I think some of the schools have begun to recognize that and started to addressing that by setting up some hotspots and buying access to the internet. But think about those younger children who don't really have the technology skills, and it's not developmentally appropriate for them to learn that way anyhow. That's another huge issue that we're finding contributing to that gap in learning. For those of you who may not have kept up with some of the research, there's something called the COVID slide that we're expecting when youngsters come back. They've lost a lot of instructional time, and they typically lose that time over the summer months anyhow, but it's going to be exacerbated as they return. The concern is that schools will only want to focus on the academic piece rather than meeting their social and emotional needs and getting them ready to learn. One of the driving forces is treatment, especially with students of color and students with disability. Angela will talk with you some more about the School-to-Prison Pipeline and what has happened over the last several decades. But now we're facing teacher shortages, major teacher shortages. And then lastly, just to pull it all together, there's some real systemic problems that have to be addressed if we're ever going to reach equitable educational opportunities things like policies have to be aligned, curriculum has to be aligned, and opportunities have to be made available for every child.
You know, there are, and I want to go back just to comment on the declining teacher workforce. Surveys, as well as just anecdotally, we're finding that teachers are retiring if they're close to retirement age, or just not renewing their contracts because they don't want to come back into a situation that they don't really have any control over with potential health concerns. So that's really going to impact our children. You've got teachers who are leaving who have years of knowledge, institutional knowledge, that's just walking out the door. And so being able to address that, you know, and that's an additional stressor for teachers who are remaining because they might not have those mentors in place that they need in order to be effective in the classroom.
Absolutely. And, you know, we had a teacher workforce shortage prior to the pandemic. It's only going to be exacerbated now.
Absolutely. I'm going to move on to the next slide, Donna, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So a little bit of historical perspective, Donna. You've been working in the area of SEL for many years, and you have, and I say that you've been ringing the bell and saying how we really need to implement SEL as part of what we're providing to our students. So can you talk about that?
Yes, I can. Absolutely. I've been kind of shouting it from the mountaintops for a long time now. And I'm really excited that people are beginning to recognize the need for SEL. But, you know, most of the beginnings of SEL came from the mental health issues that we were having in schools. Back in 1999, the Surgeon General issued a report on mental health, and that was followed by a children's mental health panel. And everything that happened within that time frame led to changes within the education world just to address some of these rising mental health concerns. And in fact, the U.S. Surgeon General stated at that time that we were in a public health crisis with children's mental health. That has only worsened. We really haven't been able to curtail that since that time. More recently, the passage of ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, has absolutely propelled SEL to the forefront, in my opinion. I think we're seeing more and more schools beginning to recognize the need for it. The more recent events with COVID-19, though, I think that's been the biggest propulsion thus far. Folks are certainly recognizing that kids are going to need social and emotional supports when they return.
And what it tells me is that the rest of us just needed to catch up with you, Donna. You know, we were getting there, but I think we really needed to catch up.
Well, I'm happy to have everybody.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next slide. About the effects of SEL.
Well, you know, there's been much written about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and I know most of our audience is quite familiar with that. But I think it's important that we recognize that not everyone will respond to trauma like the COVID-19 pandemic or the racial protests in the same manner. And it's really about perception and how we react psychologically and our own physiological reactions to those events that will determine how toxic the event is or how traumatic the event is. So in that same way, children will experience some degree of distress. All children will, because of what we've been through, but not all children will have the same level or degree of trauma. There are many variables, as Angela said, that are going to impact that, whether or not they've had access to the resources needed or have had adults that are supported in their environment. But children who don't have those supports and resources and have more trauma will be at higher risk when they return to the classroom. And what we do know is that teachers will need to have even more training in trauma-informed practices to help deal with some of these youngsters, because the impact on learning, you know, it affects their brains. And if they don't learn through some of these SEL strategies how to manage and cope with some of the stressors, they will not be able to learn. I have a real famous saying, it's famous here in Texas anyhow. It's called, when emotions are churning, they can't be learning.
Love it. I love it. Love it.
Yeah.
So we're going to remember that. I think we should probably put that on a T-shirt.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, I think so.
We could sell them for SEL for Texas.
I love it. I love it. So can we talk about some of the programs? I know schools are doing a lot, before COVID, schools were doing a lot that they were calling SEL and a lot of different programs. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Sure. This slide is a graphic that I actually developed just to help illustrate the MTSS process in most schools. Multi-tiered systems of support, in case folks are on here that don't know that the acronym. But MTSS is a process, it's a three-tiered process. And typically how schools were addressing that in the past was through two different avenues. They were either looking at academic needs or behavioral needs. So you'll see in the graphic here how all the programs that were developed to address these areas of need. On one side of this graphic, you'll see all these behavioral programs, and on the other side are all these academic programs. And these are not an exhaustive list. There are many other types of programs that are available and schools have adopted. But the problem with this, if you look at the center there, it's only looking at how schools manage their programs and what the instructional components are to do so. What's missing from this graphic is the supports that youngsters need. And these programs tend to be fragmented and operating in silos, so they're not really talking to one another in their implementation. So it's a very ineffective and inefficient way of doing business. And it's costly as well. So what SEL proposes it as the missing link to instruction or to education here, because it takes a more whole child focus.
All right, thanks. And I love it. And it goes back to the things that we saw in the video when you talk about it being the missing link, really providing that structure, benefits of behavior and discipline, looking at the academic skill and those things. Can you talk about some of the current framework? Well,
I think that there's over 100 frameworks, but
right.
There's about 40 popular frameworks right now for SEL. The most popular framework is the CASEL framework. That's what most schools have adopted. That's the framework for systemic social-emotional learning, and many schools are familiar with that framework. The issue with the framework, it doesn't matter which framework you've chosen, but that framework has to be aligned with what is happening in the school. So your programs must be aligned with that framework. Your curriculum must be aligned with that framework. Your management, your policies, your procedures, everything should be aligned in order for these programs to be more effective and less costly, because without that alignment, you're really just cherry picking. And that in and of itself is very inefficient. And what ends up happening is that we end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. And we don't want to see that happen, because if schools do that, if they approach it in that manner, they're more likely to give up and not pursue the SEL initiative. So alignment is very critical, and understanding how the framework can help to coordinate all of the processes within the school. And one more thing, Angela, it's important to understand that SEL is not a program.
Right.
It's a process. And while we have some beautiful programs out there, it's not the program is not the total solution. It has to be aligned within the framework.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. That it's not to me, it's something that's malleable, and that you are implementing to your students. And it's not something that you're just checking a box. And I think that's why it's so critically important. And these are the CASEL competencies that you were talking about.
Absolutely. Those are the 5 core competencies. And the graphic illustrates the connections between schools and communities and policies and practices, all of those components that are necessary to make that framework more effective. Again, it's not a program. It's really, but the framework drives everything.
Right. Donna, I was thinking about how does the SEL competency, how does that ensure and enhance and contribute to educational equity? And I was thinking that because you have defined structures and competencies that you're applying and are applicable to all of your students, that creates a fair playing ground for everyone, if you will.
In some way.
You're looking at the whole child, and you're looking at the whole child for every child. And so you're tailoring things for them. That's how I'm looking at it, and I'd love to get your thoughts as well.
Absolutely. I do think that absolutely kind of levels the playing field a bit, but even within that, those 5 core competencies, there have to be close attention paid to how those competencies are being taught and how the programs have been developed to help provide that instruction, because many programs out there were not really standardized with ethnically diverse populations. So we have to be aware of that and be concerned about that. But I do want to say one thing, Angela, and that is that the World Economic Forum has actually looked at what children will need when they exit us from school. And they have identified 16 core skills that youngsters need. And of those 16 skills, only 6 of them relate to academic literacy. The other 10 really are character type skills, of which the 5 core competencies are included. So it helps prepare youngsters for the workforce. And that is one of the areas in which disadvantaged youngsters have not been prepared for. So I do think it helps to level the playing field there in many ways.
Absolutely. I'm glad. And thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful. So this was getting us talking about educational equity. Do you want to say anything about that, Donna?
Well, I think the National Equity Project was a wonderful project, and a lot of good work came out of that. SocialEmotional Learning, and I think if you want to go to the next slide, I want to share just one thing.
Sure.
That it identifies two critical components there, and that is that all learning is social and emotional. And all learning is mediated by relationships. Relationships have to be a critical part of social and emotional learning. Children don't learn in a vacuum, and that relationship is fundamental to everything we do with these kiddos. But again, just emphasizing that learning is social and learning is emotional. It's really not just about putting kids in front of a worksheet or a book. For disadvantaged youngsters, inequities start really early. And as I said earlier, they tend to accumulate throughout their lifetime. And the disadvantages that compound the beginning of their schooling years will end up resulting in either them not being prepared for the workforce, even if they exit us from school, and many chances they don't exit us from school. But because of the disadvantages they start with, it can actually end up leading to more disadvantages, not just workforce disadvantages, but social disadvantages as well. So there's a ripple effect, in other words, and they can penetrate and tax a society's resources as well.
Definitely. And I think if students feel as though their culture is part of the curriculum, if you will, I think that provides a richer experience for all of the students in the class.
I would agree.
When we look at ways to integrate different aspects of cultural into the classroom, it's just, we're all learning. And it really makes the students feel as though they're part of the experience that they're having, and that we're not just teaching at them, that we're integrating it. And I'm saying this from the standpoint that we're looking to do the same thing even in law school to ensure with the cases that we teach, are there ways to weave things into the curriculum to be more culturally relevant?
Oh, wonderful.
And to identify things, because we want students to, again, feel like that we're being inclusive. And I think that's on all levels.
I think that SEL is not confined just to schools. It's a community issue as well.
Absolutely.
That's why it's important to engage those community partners. There are opportunities. Yes,
and Donna, I think about this. If you think about schools that have really integrated SEL, it's not just the students, it's not just the teachers, it's the administrators, it's the staff, it's the crossing guards, it's the the nice lady in the lunchroom, the bus drivers. They're all kind of part of this community network for kids that kids feel like they're part of, because the science shows that people want to be part of a community. And for students, their community is their school. And if they feel part of the community, they're going to want to be part of it. They're going to want to come to school. They're going to want to learn. And so thinking about how do we create that community is so key for students. And I think SEL is a great tool for us.
You make a good point. There is some truth to that term, that it takes a village, right?
Oh, definitely. The African proverb is so true. Yes, yeah, it takes a village, definitely.
And it's everyone's responsibility, not just the teachers, which we tend to want to put everything on the teacher. And it's not just about the teacher. Everyone has a role and a responsibility when the SEL is implemented.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, this is some more about educational equity.
Mm-hmm.
Really looking to, this is addressing and healing, and really looking at racism and the things that are happening, not shutting those things out, because we know that kids are coming to school having been impacted by these things, not making sure that we're not just being in a vacuum about things and really bringing it to the table.
I think, and I don't want to get ahead of us because I know you're going to be talking about implicit bias,
sure.
But I think that we need to be cognizant of some of the little things we say and do. I was listening to a webinar just this week from Dr. Daryl Sue. He's an expert on multiculturalism and implicit bias, and one of the things he talked about were these things called microaggressions.
Oh, yes.
And microaggressions are things that we unintentionally say or do. We don't mean any harm with them, but
absolutely
we don't recognize that we're saying and doing something that's offensive to the other. And we have to become more aware of that. We have to be able to acknowledge it and talk about it.
Thank you, Donna. That's, I could talk about implicit bias and microaggressions all day long. Mm-hmm. Dr. Charles Pierce, who was a Harvard professor, really coined the term microaggression in the late 70s to really identify that small things that happen to people of color on a daily basis that really, it's a slight, it's a look, it's a lot of different things that happen. But it's the context of making the person of color feel as though they are not part of the larger community, if you will. And so you're exactly right. You've got to think about things that you're doing. And the reason that we're saying that that's so critically important is because we all want to do what's best for our students.
Absolutely.
And the way to get there is to really look at self-reflection, to look inward at ourselves, to deal with our implicit bias issues. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because that's going to make us better in the classroom.
I was looking here in my notes. I had a note from that webinar that I just attended. And Dr. Sue said something that really struck me and hit home with me. He said, no one who's been born and raised in the United States is immune from inheriting the implicit bias of our ancestors.
Oh, it's true.
And that's just hit. And he said, we're all victims, and we cannot avoid it any longer. We have to address it.
We do, and I think that is why we are having what I'm calling kind of a national reckoning on race, because we have not dealt with it. We have kind of swept it under the rug. It's been too uncomfortable. We didn't want to face it. And now everybody's at home. Everybody's looking at CNN, and we have no choice. And so now we're dealing with it. And it's good. It's good that we need to do that, because it's going to make us better as a country. and it's going to be better for the next generation that comes up.
It will, but there will be those who will say, I don't want to give up my white privilege. I don't want to make the change because I've been comfortable, right?
Yeah.
And that's the hard part, is helping everyone to recognize that this is good for everyone.
It's hard if you've been in a position of power to give up that power.
Yeah.
And I am going to share. I know you're going to get copies of the PowerPoint after we're done here today, but I do have a reading list that I've compiled that I'll be happy to share that has podcasts and books and all kinds of different things for students, for you if you're interested in learning more, just from a standpoint of doing the exploration and doing the work to do that self-reflection that I'm going to be talking about with you.
Great.
All right. So let's talk about the intersection between SEL, juvenile justice, and implicit bias. We kind of have been jumping ahead on this, but I want us to think about how did we get here? We've talked that the country is really having a national conversation. We're having a national reckoning. But we're here because we haven't dealt with this issue. We have been avoiding it for years, and now it's time for us to really have that conversation. But what I find is critically important is that our students have been suffering. We've got statistics that show that our special education students are disproportionately, they represent the numbers that are suspended, 20% that receive out-of-school suspensions, 19% of students who are expelled, and 23% of students that are referred to law enforcement, 23% of students receiving school-based arrest or school-related arrest. And what's shocking to me, part of my focus at the law school is working in our clinical program, is we actually represent, with my law students, Class C ticket cases, which you would think would not be a big deal. But we're writing tickets for students age 10 and up. They can get a Class C ticket. And a ticket is like for fighting is mostly what we see, for pushing. Even though our legislature went back 5 years ago and said, no, we don't want you writing tickets to students. We want you to deal with these incidents in the schoolroom setting because we don't want them to be in the school-to-prison pipeline. But we're not doing that. So we are now at a point where we have kids that are getting tickets. And these are kids that are special ed kids. These are Black and brown kids. And it is shocking. It's shocking.
And you know, Angela, these are the youngsters that because we are not handling these, I call them typical childhood behaviors, because they are typically developmental behavior. They're developmentally appropriate under certain circumstances for youngsters to behave these ways. And so they're not dealing with these typical behaviors in a classroom. We're funneling them into the juvenile justice system. And that's what we're calling the school-to-prison pipeline.
We are. And what's troubling is, as you said, these are appropriate responses, but we're not dealing with them. We don't want to deal with them. We want someone else to deal with them. And so kids are getting tickets, which in the end gets them started it gets them started down the road to being in the criminal justice system. And the statistics that I'm sharing with you from Texas Appleseed, these are more Texas stats, but they track what's happening nationally. So, and what we're also finding is that kids who are Black and brown are disproportionately more represented. I mean, the numbers are there, and we just can't get around that. And I'm going to, people throw around the school-to-prison pipeline a lot, but I wanted everyone to have a definition. It's a combination of school disciplinary actions that remove students from the regular classrooms, such as suspensions, expulsions, and alternative school placements. And it's the criminalization of student misbehavior. And that's school-based arrest and ticketing that push Texas students, particularly students of color and special education students, out of Texas schools. And this decreases their chances of graduating and increases their chances of entering the juvenile justice and criminal justice system. So as Donna and I are saying, it's developmentally appropriate. We've had cases where, we asked the kid, we had one where the kid was 10 years old, just cute as a button, what was happening as we're interviewing, what happened? And he said, so-and-so called me a name, so I pushed him, which completely makes sense. And obviously, he probably should have used another tactic, handled it a different way. But we know that a 10-year-old boy is dealing on impulse and probably doesn't have the rationale to think about the consequences of their actions.
Yes, Angela, because that 10-year-old boy still has developmentally the prefrontal cortex of the brain has not developed. And they are acting more on impulse. I did want to say, though, that the school-to-prison pipeline is not just a Texas thing. This is a national phenomenon, and the statistics we showed you are national data. The Texas data mirrors it, and I would say that most every state in the nation is dealing with similar statistics because we have a national epidemic here with regard to disproportionate disciplining of children. And we're talking about those discretionary disciplinary incidents, not the mandatory incidents. These are things that schools have a choice in. They don't have to suspend and expel or send them to alternative placements all the time. There are certain mandatory, but the disproportionality is coming from the discretionary actions that schools are taking.
Absolutely. And this comes even though schools have a mandate that they are not to call the police. They're not to file these cases. And I'm gonna move forward here in our discussion. And yes, we're talking about national statistics, drilling down to Texas, but I wanted y'all to see even what we have found in our clinic. And so I started tracking our numbers with our Class C ticket cases. And I just started tracking them from September. And this is, Professor Downs with just an Excel spreadsheet, just pulling in numbers. It's nothing fancy. But we've had 57 cases since September of 2019. We've got 10 cases that are still pending with the pandemic. We're just kind of in a holding pattern because the courts are transitioning to Zoom or Microsoft Teams for their courts. But if you look at the client race that we're finding with the cases, it tracks what we're saying with the Black and Hispanic population. 21 of our clients have been Black, 17 have been Hispanic, 1 has been white. We have had no Asian clients. And for the type of cases that we're seeing, the majority have been assault contact. So that would be if I came up to Donna and I pinched her on the leg. An assault threat would be if I went and I threatened someone. And then a moving violation would be if you were driving a car without insurance or without a driver's license. But I want you to look at the case outcomes. And we've had 38 dismissals. We've had 5 what are called deferred dispositions, which is if you successfully complete the probationary program, it doesn't become a final conviction on your record. We've had 1 of our clients who went to teen court, and then 4 cases that received conditional dismissal. And so a conditional dismissal was there was a counseling that a student, that the client had to go to and successfully complete, and then their case was dismissed. So the cases that I'm tracking are City of Dallas cases. So these are students that are in Dallas Independent School District. They're in charter schools in Dallas. We also get some students who are in some of the outlying suburbs that get City of Dallas tickets. We've had a few up north from Collin County, which is Plano and Frisco, who have received some tickets for some things. But the numbers don't lie. I mean, we're seeing that they track what's happening statewide and what's happening actually national level. And the two photographs above, those are pictures of our community lawyering centers. And those are our neighborhood-based legal clinics where we provide legal services to the community. Our clinical space at the law school is actually located in the community because we were really wanting to ensure that we were providing services to the community. So one of the things that we've done, because we noticed that schools were not following the mandates from our legislature, is we started writing and filing motions determining that if cases were filed while students were in school, which is a no-no, they're not supposed to have the police called, that those cases need to be sent back to the schools, and we were winning. So we were really asking schools to handle those cases and use those tools and mechanisms that they have in place because they need to do that before the kids get into the school-to-prison pipeline. Yeah,
right. Absolutely.
It's it's troubling, but there are the good news is we found that if you notice the number of dismissals when our clients have representation and they have someone not only for them, we represent the student. We don't represent their parents. Of course, their parents are part of the process. They are able to better understand the consequences. They are better able to work with their parents if there's some behavior modification or some other things that need to happen. And then the parents sometimes get a clear picture about what's going on because a lot of parents don't really know what's going on. Yeah.
That's so true.
Yeah.
So, Angela, this is fantastic information. I'm watching our clock, so when we're down to 2 minutes.
Okay, let me do a little bit. We've talked a little bit about implicit bias. The one thing I want you to know about implicit bias is that we all have it. That's Black folks, white folks, Hispanic folks, Asian folks. Everyone has implicit bias, and it really focuses on the messages and the things that you came in contact with growing up that shapes you, forms you, who you're around. So you can work on your implicit bias, but as teachers and administrators, I want you to do the work to recognize it. Harvard has implicit bias tests that you can take. They've got over 300 of those. They are free. Google Harvard implicit bias test, and it'll take you right there, and you can take it and you can work on recognizing those implicit biases. One of the tools that I want you to think about, in our quest to grow and do self-reflection as teachers, as administrators, is really the use of empathy. And basically, this is just walking a mile in somebody else's shoes. We all know that saying, but really ensuring that you're looking at somebody else's worldview, looking at what it is, what are the struggles that your students have. And teachers are so good at this. And I think the reason that we become teachers is because we really love our students. One of the things that I do at law school graduation every year is I sit there with a big wad of Kleenexes because I care about my students so much, and I'm crying because I'm so happy. I want them to succeed. And we all feel that way. But we've got to really think about looking at someone else's perspective, thinking about somebody else's feelings, and figuring out if something that I do, something that I say, is that going to squelch them? Is that going to diminish that as-if quality that they might have to grow, develop, and dream?
This is one of the underlying missing competencies that youngsters have who are bullies. We find in the bullying research that those youngsters who are bullies lack empathy skills. So we need to be teaching that and it's hard to teach empathy. How do you teach empathy? But it can be taught, and it can be taught through social emotional learning programs. So,
and that's the beauty of social emotional learning, is that you are, when you do things like a talk circle, when you're doing morning meeting, when you're doing those temperature checks with your kids to see how they're doing, once you go through that and you recognize that maybe they didn't have such a good night, maybe they didn't sleep well, you can make those adjustments in what you need to do so that they can have the best experience that they can have, and that when you're ready to provide information in the curriculum to them, they're ready to learn.
That's one of the best ways to begin to teach empathy is through service learning projects.
Oh, yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Which is a little bit challenging right now, of course.
Absolutely.
But, there are, what we're doing at the law school is we've really changed, and we're providing volunteer opportunities for our students through online platforms. So we're actually doing information sessions with the community on their property, looking at property issues, looking at other issues, know your rights. I did a session with Cafe Momentum, which is a youth organization focused on teaching young people the restaurant trade. But they felt a surge after the protest of what to do with their rights. And so I went in and did a talk with them, but it was over Zoom. So really looking to see, are there opportunities that we can do to connect? Because I think that connectedness is something that's really challenging for us. So empathy, but also let's think about some of the messages that you're sending. And one of the questions that someone said is really, how do you give up your power or privilege so that all students in your class will benefit? And I think you're really at the right step. It was Kim who asked the question, but it's really recognizing that there is privilege and then really doing something about it, ensuring that you are providing a situation where everyone can be heard in your classroom, I think is a really big step toward really creating a more inclusive environment in your classroom. So why are we talking about this? Why is this so important? And it's because our students are feeling these things. Our students are recognizing the inequities that are happening in their classrooms, and they're speaking out. There is a school in Dallas called Lake Highlands in the Dallas Independent School District where students actually went and started a campaign to be heard. And one of the issues that they identified was the students of color were not encouraged to take advanced placement classes. So they said that teachers would tell them, "Oh, are you sure you really want to do that? Is that all right? Are you going to be okay?" But someone just corrected me that Lake Highlands is in Richardson ISD. Yes, it is in Dallas, but it's in Richardson ISD. Thank you for that. And also Highland Park High School, which is a rather Tony enclave in Dallas. They actually had a Dear Highland Park campaign where students of color in Highland Park actually said, hey, what we're doing for racial diversity and equity and inclusion is not working. We need to do better. They put together a curriculum, a plan, actually posted it, put together a wonderful video. We've included the link here for you. So kids are really feeling this and they're speaking up on it. I also have the Black At. There are a lot of universities and colleges and law schools where students of color are saying, this microaggression has happened to me, this has happened to me, and we need to deal with it. So really thinking about the messages that you are sending in your class. What are you saying? Are you saying that if a student comes to you and says, hey, I'm really interested in advanced placement, are you saying it's not for you? Are you telling them it's that the class might be too hard for them? If a student is too talkative or too loud, how are you addressing that? Because for some students, their excitement They're so on fire about whatever the material is that they really want to be included in the conversation. But how are you addressing that? And are you seeing that perhaps as a discipline issue when you could perhaps look at it through a different lens? How can you make your curriculum more inclusive? What are the books that you are using? I know a lot of schools do read-arounds. Read-arounds, is that what they're called, Donna? I don't want to get the term incorrect. Read-alouds. Read-alouds or read-arounds. What are the books? I mean, you can see on my shelf behind me, I've got a bunch of different books for young people. Just looking at different cultures just to ensure that you're being inclusive. And also, what are the parents' needs? How do you get buy-in from the parents? Because we know that there is stress, there are many strainers that parents are going through, and we know a lot of our kids are living in multi-generational settings. And I think you also, a lot of times, and I don't want to forget to say this, I think someone just put a note as I was getting ready to say this, which I'm kind of excited about. We also need to recognize students who might be LGBTQIA, really ensuring that they have a safe space, that we can really ensure that they feel welcomed in the classroom as well. There are a lot of really great materials and books out there. Our law school does great work with Lambda Legal and also a resource center in Dallas. So make sure that you're looking at all of these things, and because I know all of us want to create an environment where our students can really grow and can really, just do the best that they can. Because we know that when we do that introspection, it makes us better. We start looking at systems, and then we can also help to implement change within those systems.
Good.
So, Donna, I know that was a mouthful.
That's okay. Good. Very good.
So also think about things. You talked about microaggressions. I'm so glad you brought that up. But if someone says something that's inappropriate, I think that can be really challenging because...
Can I interject here?
Please.
Because I think it's very important for everyone to understand that these microaggressions do occur, and they are occurring. And we're not saying that we need to reprimand and leave it at that. We're saying there has to be open dialogue. We don't want to continue to admire the problem, but we want to have a proactive approach to dealing with the problem. So I think it's important for us when these things happen, we have to acknowledge them. And we have to say, let's talk about it and let's get it out on the table.
Oh, we absolutely, yes, because when you acknowledge them, when you recognize them, and then your students see that you're dealing with it right then and there, and they know that this is not a space where this is tolerated, it's going to change the conversation. And I want to go back. Someone put a note and mentioned the book Push Out. One of the fastest growing groups for discipline that we're seeing is Black girls. We're seeing that Black girls are being funneled into the school-to-prison pipeline at a higher rate than any other group. There's a wonderful book by Monique Woods called Push Out. I'm going to actually hold up this. You can see I've started dog-earing this one. This is her latest book that kind of continues the conversation. It is called Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, and it's an education of liberation for Black and brown girls. Great book. There's also a documentary from Push Out that has great information about the adultification of Black girls, how Black girls, adultification meaning that Black girls are made to seem like adults and are viewed as less innocent than other girls and from other races at a younger, when they're the same age. But it's a real dynamic that's happening. And so we really need to think about these things as we're looking to build these more inclusive and equitable classrooms. So what can you say when folks say something? Obviously, I love Donna saying we really want to deal with it right then and there. Right that ship, guys. Deal with it. Don't let it fly. Saying that's not funny, I find that offensive. What you said is just harmful. We don't say things like that. Help me understand your thinking. And then I'm not comfortable with that.
Yeah, don't just leave it at a reprimand. That's what I'm saying. You can't just reprimand and move on. You have to talk about it.
You do. And it doesn't have to be a long lecture and preachy, but you can nip it in the bud so that everyone in the room gets a signal that this is not going to be tolerated. This is something that is not acceptable behavior.
Right.
Definitely. Thank you, Donna, for that. That's really great. So what can you do? What are some things that you can do if you want to change your worldview? So let's think, because I'm a type A personality as a lawyer and a judge, and I like to think about tangibles that I can do. Obviously, making a friend who's different from you, that changes your worldview. It changes your perspective. Learning about a new culture, I think, is great. A great way to do that, since we're all at home, is through food. You can, eat your way through any culture. And even though we can't be together in person, there are great cultural events that are happening online. I've been taking an African dance class online, which has been a lot of fun. No judgment, but, with my dancing skills. But it's just a fun way to learn and to do things. And also,
there's a wonderful resource for younger elementary age kids, and it's called Empatico, EMPATICO. It's a free online resource where teachers can actually pair up with another teacher around the world and teach a lesson to learn about their culture. So
okay.
Just want to share that. Empatico.
Practice loving kindness meditation. Everyone's being and looking at areas of mindfulness as far as ways to kind of get grounded and centered, because there's so much chaos. But there are studies that prove if you will send positive thoughts and energy to people that you are in conflict with, that not only does that bring your blood pressure down, but it changes your outlook on the world around you. Get to know your neighbors. We don't know our neighbors, even though we are at home all the time. And now this is a good opportunity for you to attend a service at a mosque, a temple, or a church. You can do it virtually, so it's great. And I also want you to think about how you are reacting to discipline problems in your class. What are you doing? Obviously everyone is overwhelmed. We're stressed. We've got so many constraints and so many things on us. But how are we doing? How can we handle things? What can we do? And also the most important thing is when you see injustice, to speak up. So, yeah. All right, so that's that. And now we've got our resources, Donna.
Good. Wonderful. We did.
We did. So do you want to talk about SEL for Texas, please, Donna?
Well, yes, SEL for Texas, a SocialEmotional Learning Alliance for Texas, so you can go to our website and join. But we are one of 18 different states that have joined a national alliance called the SEL for US Group. We'd love to have you Texas folks join us, but if you're not from Texas, there are other states as well, and your state may already have an organization formed. If they haven't, you may want to look into forming one yourself.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
So what's our next one? Oh, Committee for Children has a ton of resources. Absolutely, it's available on their website, and Jen has talked about some of those already.
Yes. In fact, I'll just say really quickly here that these resources are all going to be available if they're not already on our website. We are creating a anti-racism guide to the Second Step family of programs. So you won't see that yet in our resources, but it is coming soon. I got that as a question in the chat box a few different times. So just wanted to clarify that. This slide will be in the follow-up, so we can just go ahead and kind of skip to the next, and then we'll go to questions.
Wonderful. I think we already talked about this slide with the National Equity Project, that all learning is social and emotional, and all learning is mediated by relationships. And all of those relationships do fit in a socio-political, racialized context. So we have to be cognizant of that, and we have to recognize the need to discuss and just get it out in the open here.
Absolutely.
This is true for all children, not just children of color. We have to help them understand that we're all in this together. We're one people.
Yeah, we really are. And I've just seen firsthand the difference with kids that have come before me in my courtroom, ones that have a community around them and those that do not. And I've had kids that come to court that have had their teacher with them, their grandparents, neighbors, and were so surrounded and supported that they were able to get on track.
Good.
But it's the kids that don't have that support, that don't have that support structure, that they just don't fare so well. And so I want to keep kids out of the criminal justice system.
Right.
That's why I'm so passionate about SEL as a judge and as a law professor, because I see these kids. I see them, and they need something. They need SEL.
They do.
They really need it.
They need them for life.
Yeah, they do. But the skills that they learn in SEL as kids, they will be able to use them throughout their entire life.
That is absolutely true.
Those are my thoughts. Donna, do you have any final thoughts to share?
Same thing, Angela. I'm just so very passionate about this. I do think that SEL has this is an opportunity for us to really embrace it and really disrupt that status quo and make our schools more equitable for everyone.
Let's do it. Let's disrupt the status quo.
Absolutely. I think with you two, that would be it's quite inspiring, and it would. I think you're already doing that. So,
well, if they just put us in charge, would be okay, right? If we were just in charge.
I know, if only. So I do have a few questions I pulled out. We won't get to all of them, but we've answered a few along the way. So thank you for watching the chat box and then just kind of answering here and there. Let's see. We've got a few. Let's start with this one. How does a white male American-born teacher give up the power of white privilege so that all the students in his class will benefit? Maybe just a few tips on that.
I think really recognizing that there is white privilege, that there are systems in place that have provided an advantage, I think is really the first step. Mm-hmm. Then looking at what you're doing in the classroom and ensuring that you have an inclusive environment where you're recognizing the beauty of the different cultures that are there in that classroom with you, I think can really, really broaden the experience that you provide for your students.
And I will say this again, I cannot put enough stress enough the need for these relationships to develop. That once you develop the relationship, you can move mountains with that relationship in many ways. But again, it's not just on the teacher to increase this awareness. It's really a systems issue. Mm-hmm. But certainly teachers bear responsibility as well. But our systems have to address the issues at the system level.
Wow, it was like you read my mind of the next question. So the question is, in addition to the changes that schools can make, like using restorative justice or integrating culturally relevant SEL, as you've talked about today, addressing racist policies and staff implicit biases, that's a lot to do on its own. But what do you think needs to change about the educational system at the county, state, and federal level to address those statistics we see and the issues?
A lot of things. Allocating resources is a big part of it, and how those resources are allocated. We've struggled with this in every state. Funding of education is a huge issue. But when we're funding more and more our prison system, we can't fund the education system, right? So we have to turn that around. And this whole SchooltoPrison Pipeline has become a money-eating entity itself. So we have to look at how our resources are being allocated, number one. But we also have to make sure that when I talk about equitable, that's not the same thing as equal. Equal and equitable are two different things. And equitable is really about making sure that youngsters who are disadvantaged at the very beginning have that early start they need. So every child should be in a preschool program, every child. And the United States ranks pretty poorly in that area. We're actually in the bottom third when you compare us to 41 of the richest countries. We don't do well at primary school or preschool education, and that's where we're going to have to do better, because we've got to give them that jump start they need.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I'll just agree with everything that you said, Donna.
Great.
So kind of along those lines, how do we challenge zero tolerance policies using the SEL mindset? I know a lot of different schools and districts, even private schools, would have this zero tolerance policy. What are ways they could challenge those that might be productive?
That's a loaded question, because it requires more than one thing to happen. There are multiple variables involved in that. One is that zero tolerance policies don't align with SEL philosophy at all. So at the district level, districts have to address those policies on discipline if they want to pursue SEL. Now, there are certain mandatory actions that have to occur with behavior because of school safety issues, but most of our behavioral disciplinary policies don't really relate to mandatory expulsions and suspensions. They really are about those low-level behaviors. And when we're looking at making that change, we have to change school culture and climate as a first step, because the climate and the culture drives that climate, but the culture and the climate are the foundation to beginning that whole process with SEL.
Yeah, and a lot of those decisions for discipline, they're discretionary. Even though there's a zero tolerance policy, you still have discretion on whether or not and how you're going to handle these things. But of course, you're going to look at your policy with everything.
Yes.
Okay. The only last question, I think we may have sort of taken care of it, was giving the information about the Harvard bias test. Was asked a couple of times to discuss it a little bit more detail.
Sure. Absolutely. So the Harvard Implicit Bias Test, there is a body of research, and it's just, if you Google Harvard Implicit Bias, it should come up. And it's a series of tests that really measure your implicit bias by your responses to a series of questions. And they have tests for race, for gender, for weight, for just anything you can imagine where you might potentially have a bias. And what's interesting is we found that Black folks have a bias against other Black people when they take that test. But if you think about it, it makes sense, because what are the messages that we have been given? Through beauty, through what's acceptable. And it's not an African-American narrative that's been found as being positive. But you can, if you recognize on your implicit biases and you recognize the unconscious things that are happening with you, you can address it and really kind of turn the corner and work on that, and kind of take a step back as you're reacting to things, and to make a little bit more of an informed decision on how you're going to handle different actions.
Okay, well, I think on that note, we will go ahead and say goodbye for today. I want to thank both of our presenters, Angela and Donna, for all of their hard work on this presentation, but really for all the work you do every single day, certainly to really help students and our communities to be stronger and kinder, and to build the world that will make sure everybody feels supported. So I hope you have supported us in doing this webinar, and we really want to support all of you that are our audience. So we do encourage you to please visit our website, cfchildren.org. Come back for another webinar in the future. All of our webinars are also on demand, so this one will be as well. So thank you everyone once again for being here. We did get a lot of people who stayed all this time. So thank you for those of you who really, who stuck with us. We appreciate you. I hope it was helpful.
Our apologies for running over, Jen. But it was, we can't stop talking about this.
I know.
We're bad.
We are. Well, we're passionate, Donna. We're very passionate. We're passionate.
That's right. And I think our audience agrees.
And it was our pleasure to do this for you, Jen, and we appreciate Committee for Children as well.
Oh, definitely.
Okay. Well, everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. We'll see you again online soon. Take care and be well, okay?
All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.